ordered while Paul made a slight hue adjustment to the picture. "Don't mess things up," Chester warned Paul, though Anna thought he was still talking to her. "A please would have been nice," Anna thought, but still determined to do whatever it took for the day to succeed. She bowed her head, asked for no help, was offered none by her family, and so commenced preparing salt pork, biscuits, and gravy. The second half began, and the Dallas offense finally developed a plan for the severe conditions. They started running sweeps, featuring the reliable and sure-footed Dan Reeves. It didn't matter if the Cowboy linemen made the run, because it was unlikely the Green Bay defenders could respond in time to do much more than get in the way. On the first drive, Reeves gained yardage with ease. Unexpectedly, Meredith started slinging the football with something approximating accuracy. On a 3rd and 14 from the Green Bay 22, Meredith faded to pass. He saw an opening and decided to run as far as possible. It was doubtful he could have gotten the first down, but any closer to the end zone made for an easier field goal. It was a smart and veteran play. But Meredith was having a difficult time with the cold, and his hands were at least partially numb. When Green Bay linebacker Leroy Caffey tackled him, Meredith fumbled the ball and the Cowboys recovered. They should have stayed with the sweeps, Mark noted, and he was right. He was starting to feel a lot more comfortable with what was taking place, and he thought he'd found a repetitious pattern of pressure points that seemed to work. The Doomsday defense smothered Green Bay's suddenly inept offense, and the Packers were forced to immediately punt the ball back to Dallas. Anna called for an update. Because the crackling and frying of the salt pork was so loud, she couldn't hear the broadcast. Chester called out, "Come take a look for yourself, and while you're here, you can take my plate. When's the biscuits and gravy going to be ready?" Anna ignored his suggestion and question. On the next Dallas drive, 3 straight plays to Reeves, 2 running and 1 passing, toward the wide side of the field, marched the team to the Green Bay 30-yard line. In Chester's excitement, some of the sauerkraut juice remaining on his plate spilled into his lap. He yelled, "God damn it, Anna! Would you please come in here and take this plate?" She'd almost had enough. She was on the verge of breaking more than one of the 10 commandments. She stormed into the living room and grabbed the plate from her husband. She pulled it so quickly from his lap, the aforementioned kraut juice flew across the room and several streams struck Mark in the face. One splattered directly into his left eye and he screamed, "Ah, my eye!" Anna was horrified and rushed to his aid. With Mark momentarily out of touch with the game, Dallas inexplicably veered from what was working and allowed Meredith to fade back for a slow-developing pass play. Once again, it was Leroy Caffey who sacked the Cowboy quarterback for a huge loss. "God damn Texans!" Chester yelled, knowing where Leroy Caffey was born and bred. While Anna attempted to help her stricken son, Danny Villanueva missed a 47-yard field goal attempt. Chester stared at his wife with contempt and announced loudly, "That was just great. Look what you did." There were many things Anna thought to say to her husband. She wanted to say things she knew would hurt him. Instead, she finished dabbing Mark's eyes with a warm, wet cloth she had deftly and hurriedly prepared in the kitchen. Then she left the living room and kitchen, with salt pork still frying and batter in need of blending. She left it all, and her family, and the game too. She went unnoticed down the hallway and into the only room where her dignity might be restored, her bathroom. His stinging eye relieved, with only a slight awareness of the tension in the room, Mark returned his concentration to the game. The Packer offense was stuffed again and they were forced to punt. As the third quarter ended, Dallas had possession at the 50-yard line. The salt pork was starting to turn a burnt and inedible black. Smoke began filling the kitchen. It was obvious that Dallas had found an exploitable strategy, but the field was almost unplayable. They needed to strike fast, and it needed to be a touchdown. Mark closed his eyes and concentrated all his energy on the sound of the broadcast. In what he would always consider one of his finest moments of pure inspiration, Mark knew what they were going to do. As they formed their huddle for the first play of the fourth quarter, Mark opened his eyes and watched Dan Reeves put his hands inside his pants for a critical warming. "Dad, Paul, watch this." Mark announced with a sure smile. Reeves took a handoff from Meredith and swept to his left, just as he did for huge chunks of yardage in the third quarter. The entire Green Bay defense slid as best as they could toward him, abandoning all discipline of their assignments. But instead of tiptoeing down the field for a first down or more, Reeves pulled up and hoisted a long pass down the field to a wide-open Lance Rensel, who caught the ball and easily loped into the end zone. The extra point was good. The Cowboys led 17-14. The living room exploded with joy. For the second consecutive year, Dallas rallied from an early 14-0 deficit. But this time, they took the lead from the vaunted and legendary champions. They were in Green Bay's home stadium, and the Dallas Cowboys were in complete control. They were achieving mastery over both sides of the line of scrimmage. Their strategies were clear, and their execution was crisp. No less crisp was the blackened salt pork, smoke walling off the back of the living room and streaming out the barely open sliding glass door leading to the front porch from the kitchen. In his joy, Chester forgot the ugly comments he directed to his wife. He didn't even know she was no longer within immediate earshot. He sniffed and then joyfully called out, "You're putting quite a sear on that pork, aren't you, honey?" It was Paul who realized the cooking food was unattended. He sprang from his chair and, burying his face into the inside of his t-shirt, he entered the kitchen. He immediately turned off the stove and fully opened the sliding door, fanning the smoke from the room with a spare apron. Meanwhile, Chester and Mark watched Green Bay and Dallas exchange punts. The cursing going on in the kitchen and the fact that Anna was not present suddenly distracted Mark. Green Bay drove to the Dallas 33-yard line. Chester snapped, "Stay focused!" The drive stalled, and Green Bay kicker Don Chandler missed a 40-yard field goal that would have tied the game. Whew, boy, that was a close one. Say, where the hell is everyone? They looked around the living room, then toward the kitchen, and finally down the hall. Mark said, "I think Mom's hurt, Dad, and I think she burned the pork." "You think so?" yelled Paul from the kitchen. Chester rubbed his bald scalp with his right hand and realized everything. There was hell hath no fury waiting for him down the hallway. There was a mess in the kitchen that needed tending. There were wrongs that needed to be righted all over the apartment. There was also a championship ball game on the tube. Money was on the table. Which family duties should they do? Mark said, "Dad, the game's almost over. We can sort everything out later. We've almost got it won." Chester smiled slightly at the like-mindedness of his young son and said, "Paul, stay in the kitchen and clean the mess." Paul answered, "Fine, but I get your car later." Without hesitation, Chester answered, "You got it." Mark and Chester returned their attention to the game. The Cowboys had the ball. Anna O'Byrne sat on her throne, fully clothed. She was so wounded in so many ways, she didn't know where to start the patching process. She came back to her bathroom and pouted until hearing joyful, screaming shouts from the living room. Despite her desire to continue pouting, she was suddenly filled with curiosity as to the wonderful events taking place in her home. But pride kept her seated, and all she could effectively do was cry. She cried buckets. When the smoke from her kitchen reached all the way down the hallway, she felt she'd cried enough. Her eyes burned and her lips felt dry and old. She stood up from her throne and went to the medicine cabinet. Inside was the jar of Vaseline, the very same Vaseline she'd hoped the referees had had handy earlier. She opened the lid and saw a strange thing. The integrity of the contents of the jar were ruthlessly violated. It looked as though someone inserted a spoon and stirred. What could have done such a thing? Then it suddenly occurred to her. When she'd come back to her bathroom to pout, the light was off. It had been on only a little while earlier. She was absolutely certain no one had left the living room since Mark returned from the bathroom at halftime. Why would Mark have been in her bathroom? Why would Mark need Vaseline? She brought the jar close to her eyes for inspection. Then she saw the hair, and she knew. Mark and Chester were completely connected to the championship game. They were of one mind. There were less than 6 minutes remaining. Don Meredith had just completed a pass to Frank Clark for a Dallas first down. If the Cowboys continued holding onto the ball, Green Bay would be forced to use all their timeouts and Dallas would win the game. As the Cowboys approached the line of scrimmage for the next play, Anna re-entered the living room, striding with purpose, and firmly turned off the television. She was holding the jar of Vaseline. Paul peeked from the kitchen to see why the television was silent, and he saw what his mother was holding. It only took him a moment to realize something seriously bad was happening in the living room, and he quickly moved to his own room and closed the door. In those moments after the television was turned off, but just before Anna handed the jar to her husband, Chester could only stare. Opening his mouth produced sputtering sounds. He was incapable of coherent speech. Then she handed him the jar. She shoved it close to his face. Chester stared at his wife like he thought her crazy. "Look at it," she ordered, and Chester had no choice but to stare into the violated contents. Then he saw the hair, and though it took a little longer to register on him than Anna, he also knew. Mark's head was down, and his time of guilt-free pleasure was at an end. With so much injustice in the room, no one could speak. No one could even figure out who should go first. As much as possible, Chester wanted to wrap things up quickly and get back to the game. A pleading look toward Anna told him an immediate resolution was probably not possible. Furthermore, it was obvious from her gaze, this particular issue was for Chester to deal with and not her. And it needed to be dealt with at once. "Forget the game for now," Anna ordered, and everyone in the living room was powerless but to obey. "Stand up and drop your pants," Chester instructed Mark. "Dad," Mark began, but he never got to finish. "Stand up and drop your pants now," he demanded. Without further hesitation, because delay could mean real cruelty, and because Mark also hoped to get back to the game, he stood, dropped his pants, and 2 pairs of underwear. The sight looked far worse than it actually was, and it certainly was vastly improved since sunrise, but it still looked really bad. It was gel and sores, and matted short hair, and berries gone over, and the sagging of the stalk. A silence followed. Chester was immediately sorry he'd made Mark drop his pants, but he felt guiltier at how he'd spoken to Anna earlier. He owed her something. In fact, he owed her several things. Finally, Chester asked, "You screwed the Vaseline jar?" "No," replied Mark with truth and indignation. "I just needed to use the Vaseline, and I was in a hurry, and because I didn't want Mom to catch me. I was really hurting." He was telling the truth, and everyone knew it, but that didn't fully explain the angry mess on display. With mostly disgust, but a little curiosity, Chester asked, "What the hell caused that?" "Overuse?" Mark answered feebly. Chester glared at his youngest son. "Son, I've been with men at sea. I know what overuse looks like. You don't get that from your hand. What the hell have you been doing to yourself? Metal tongs or something?" "No," Mark again answered truthfully. This could have gone on for a long time, this question and answer. It was going to get them nowhere fast. Chester said, "Boy, you better come to your senses right quick. The time for bullshit is over. The time for truth is now. You're going to goddamn tell us what we want to know, or you and I are going to go in your room, and I'll get it out of you." This wasn't much of a choice, so Mark answered quickly, "Oh, you know, stuff around the room, socks, rubber bands, my catcher's mitt, some 45s. There was a pause at this, and then Chester asked, 45s. Yeah, Mark confirmed with dawning shame. There was another pause, and then Anna asked, which 45s? Mark admitted, I didn't always look, but I remember a Peggy Lee and a Mitch Miller and a Johnny Mathis. Johnny Mathis? Seconds later, Paul burst from his bedroom where he was listening to the game on the radio, debating whether or not he should interrupt. You better turn on the TV quick, he screamed. Oh, good Lord, what are we doing? Anna groaned as she turned on the set, while Chester still held and stared at the jar, and Mark quickly pulled up his underwear. During the time the television was off, all semblance of control abandoned the Dallas Cowboys. Their drive immediately stopped, and they were forced to punt. Green Bay took over with 4 minutes 50 seconds left in the game at the Packer 32-yard line. Green Bay marched down the field with sudden, gleeful precision. Plays were working that hadn't worked the entire game. Cowboy players could no longer stand on their feet, and the bitter cold reached out and attacked them in the very core of their manhood. When the picture returned to the O'Byrne household, the Packers had a first down and goal to go from the Dallas 1-yard line. Anna made the sign of the cross and sat down in her seat muttering, oh dear Lord, what have I done? The Packers are going to win the game, Chester announced to no one in particular, after glancing briefly at the television and then back to the Vaseline. This comment was strange to Mark, who quickly pulled up his pants and sat down. It was Chester who taught him to keep trying until the contest was concluded. But one look at his distracted father told Mark that Chester was probably finished with his efforts toward the game. With grit and determination, Mark announced to the room, they're not in the end zone yet. But in that moment when faith was most required, before all was lost, before the final gun sounded, when the Cowboys were still leading the game, temporarily whipping the Hex and on the verge of victory, the rest of the O'Byrne family stopped believing. On first down, Donnie Anderson was halted for no gain. Mark sensed a glimmer of hope from Paul. Of course, it might have just been relief that the whole ordeal was almost over. Chester and Anna still didn't believe, even after Donnie Anderson slipped on second down and was once again stopped for no gain. Green Bay called their last time out with 16 seconds remaining. There was time for one more play. Mark looked to his parents for guidance. Anna smiled slightly at him, lovingly, but she bore the look of disappointed resignation. Chester did not look at him, but muttered distastefully to Anna, Mitch Miller. Mark closed his eyes and listened. Just as he did earlier, just as he had the year before on the key play of the game, Mark knew what was about to happen. There would be no field goal. Lombardi would go for the victory. It was his day, and he knew it. Green Bay was attacking the Dallas defense correctly. If Anderson could have stayed on his feet, he'd have scored the previous play. So they would eliminate the handoff and go with the quarterback sneak over the same spot. The defensive linemen were the only ones capable of reacting in time to defend a short yardage play, and all the ground beneath their feet was ice. They had no basis of experience to deal with these conditions, no training whatsoever, and there was no one present or watching who could possibly help them. Dad, Mark pleaded weakly. Just prior to the start of the key play of the season, Chester finally looked at his youngest son and said, I like Peggy Lee, though. The Cowboy defensive linemen did the best they could, and in fact they did very well considering the lead Green Bay lineman on the play, Jerry Kramer, actually jumped offside. No penalty was called, and Bart Starr scored on a quarterback sneak. The extra point was good. After two futile passes from Meredith fell incomplete, the game was over. The final score was Packers 21, Cowboys 17. They sat in silence for almost 5 minutes before Chester finally began. I don't know where to start. And that was as far as he could get without help. Mark suggested, why don't you start with Mom? I'm going to go shower. We'll talk later. Paul didn't stick around for a talk or even dinner. He got the keys and was gone within 15 minutes. He didn't return until just before the annual Orange Bowl halftime show late the next day. Mark went to the shower, and just as he had almost 1 year to the day earlier, he cried. It was difficult to pinpoint the worst of his hurts. His penis was improving, and there was no desire to indulge in those pleasures, even for old time's sake. The burn of the soap and water actually felt good, and he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever pain he endured was penance. He took a long shower. He knew a talk was coming, but he was wrong. They never mentioned the Vaseline incident, or any of the events which led to the Vaseline incident. Anna wanted to, but Chester told her there were more important matters to address and forbid the issue from family business. He told his wife that the boy tried to do whatever it took to win. He played in pain. He misused himself, that's all, and the loss was proof and guilt enough. He insisted that nothing should come between a young man and his dick. He also assured her that Mark would soon outgrow 45s. More importantly, and even before any of that was discussed, Chester O'Byrne dropped to a knee and begged Anna's forgiveness. There was no denying his sincerity, and there was no way Anna could hold a grudge against her high school sweetheart. Chester still didn't agree with his wife on the matter of religion and their children, but there was no excuse for the way he'd spoken to his beloved Anna. He told her that he deserved a whipping, and she said the loss was whipping enough for both of them. Anna also admitted to Chester that despite her best intentions, and despite everything that happened during the day, once again, she failed to do her duty for her family when it mattered most. She'd insulted Mark and almost blinded him. And then, if she'd only stayed in her bathroom and not come out and turned off the television, if she'd only waited, they could have talked about the Vaseline after the game. Eventually, they did just that. They talked it all out and ended with a warm embrace after discovering the one truth about the day in which they both agreed. The loss was a turning point for Mark O'Byrne. After a shower of almost 45 minutes and a full dose of medicine swallowed by 2 glasses of water, he retired for the evening. His fever went higher, and he didn't succumb to Anna's medicinal wisdom until later. He needed to recover a bit of childhood that for the first time seemed distant. He turned on the Teddy Boy radio. He didn't care what was on. He just wanted a companion for the evening. It was a Spanish-speaking station. The voice was instantly soothing to Mark. He lay down on the fresh sheets and settled his neck and head into the cool pillowcase. The disc jockey's voice abruptly gave way to sparkling mariachi music. The chills from his fever seemed to join the music in a vibration dance. Mark stretched himself into the time-honored position. His fingers reached and touched. He shivered slightly, closed his eyes, and turned his thoughts on himself. And oh yes, he knew at day's end that he had a gift. Probably more than one, but one for sure. He was connected to the game in a deeper way than he could understand when the day began. His own father tried to tell him, and if he'd understood, the outcome might have been different. Then, when the outcome was still in doubt, his own father stopped believing in him. His entire family stopped believing. Something would have to be done about that, and he needed to get a grip on his privates. So he did, and bravely smiled. It was time to learn and take responsibility for the things he could do. He'd do it for the sake of the home team. There was a knock on his bedroom door. Chester asked, "Son, may we come in?" Mark turned on his side and turned off the radio while responding, "Yes, please." Once inside, Anna said, "There's something we need to tell you." Mark asked, "Can I ask you something first?" They nodded. Mark asked, "Why did you stop believing in me when the game was on the line?" They never answered that question. Instead, they said in unison, "We believe in you now." Are there any questions?